What are the costs involved in outsourcing your app's development? That's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm not just talking about the literal price to build your app. You can find that information in lots of different places, but what you don't find are the ongoing and long-term costs that you can expect when outsourcing your app. What happens not just now in that initial development, but all the way down the road throughout the lifetime of your app. This is one of the things that causes a lot of app entrepreneurs to fail before they ever really build real traction, because they know the upfront costs of building their app. But once they get halfway through, they hit a lot of obstacles in terms of expenses that they didn't expect, because you don't know what you don't know. And when they get to this point, they've blown their budget, they don't have anything left, they can't keep moving forward, so they're left with all of these past expenses they've incurred, a half-built app, and nowhere to go from there. And to be clear, this applies whether you are outsourcing a no-code app or whether you're outsourcing to a traditional development agency. So we're going to break this down today in depth. We're going to go through all of the costs that you can expect to incur as you build your app for the lifetime of your app. And make sure you stick around until the end, because we're also going to talk about some alternatives that might be a better fit for you. First, if you're new around here, my name is Kristen, and I'm the co-founder of Coaching No Code Apps, where we help business owners and industry experts build custom apps to either start their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses, all without coding. So let's dive right in. Okay, so you need to think about your app's lifecycle in 3 separate stages. So number 1, down here at the bottom, we have your initial development stage. So this is when you start building that initial core app, your minimum viable product. This is the first version that you're going to release to your test users or your beta users. Now, the base costs for this, now these can really vary a lot, but the base costs are $10,000 to $15,000 at a base price with an agency if you're going with a no-code agency, and that's for your minimum viable product. With a traditional development agency, that could easily be doubled, tripled, and beyond. Again, it really depends. And of course you can find cheaper. Of course you can find more expensive. The quality of the app is going to reflect both ends of that. But those are kind of some baselines that you can expect. Now, again, those are just your base costs there. So you probably, if you do your research, you can get a good idea of what those base costs are going to be. You can speak to different agencies that you might want to work with, etc. Okay, so you can get those base costs. That part is really easy. What's not easy and what's not usually on the surface and available for you to see are the other price that are going to add on to that base cost. So first you have to think about, number 1, revisions. So your app, that first version, it's never going to be perfect the first time around. That's just not going to happen. That's not the reality. There are going to be revisions that need to be made, because remember, you're taking an idea that you have in your brain that has grown and lived there, and you're giving it to someone else to build. That means that they're going to have to work to get it right, and they're going to have to work with you. That's just a part of the process. So you have to think about the revisions that you're going to have to go through with the freelancer or the agency you're working with. Now, sometimes a revision might be included. Multiple revisions might be included. It depends. Sometimes they're not included at all. So if you have to pay for revisions, or if you have to pay extra for additional revisions, that's another added expense that you have to factor into that initial base cost. Now, number 2, you also have to think about error handling and issues that come up with development. This is a completely normal part of development. There will be issues that come up. things that need to be fixed. And whatever agency or a freelance team you're working with, hopefully they will go through and do the best they possibly can to make sure that the app they're handing you at the end is error-free. But inevitably, you're probably still going to find things that need to be fixed. That's just part of the process. Now, sometimes there might be a phase or a time span where these types of things are covered. Now, that means it's on you to do the work to uncover those errors pretty immediately after getting that app back. And that might mean bringing users on board the app right away. And if you don't, and you don't find them until later, then you might not be in that time frame where you can get those fixed. And again, this process will depend and it will vary on the agency or the person that you're working with. But of course, whoever you're outsourcing to, they will have to keep some sort of a time frame or a time limit on these types of things. You will be agreeing to a scope when you start working with them, and anything that goes beyond that, even if it's revisions or error handling, etc., anything that goes beyond that is obviously going to incur extra costs. So, errors, bugs, and etc. Again, this is all going to depend, but all of these things can greatly increase that base cost. Again, depending on your own user testing, your own speed at testing, the scope you're agreeing on, and so on. But this could 2x plus your cost easily. So those are kind of those base costs when you're first building that initial version of your app. But after that, you move into the next phase, which is, we'll call it post MVP. But really what this is your testing phase. When you are first releasing your app to those initial test and beta users, and you're starting to get feedback and you need to make changes and updates to the app. Now, these are different from those initial revisions or any errors, functionality, bugs and tweaks and things like that. This is now where you're getting user feedback and you're actually adding to the app's functionality. You are changing how some of that functionality works and so on. So when you're in this stage, you're immediately going to have lots of changes to make to the app if you're doing your job. If you're bringing users on board, you're getting the right feedback, it is guaranteed that you will have lots of changes to make to the app. And this is a really good thing. It means you're building the app for your users. But on that same note, it of course means that you are again going to be incurring extra costs in order to implement all those changes and updates. So you have to ask yourself, how much is the agency or the freelancer you've worked with, how much are they going to charge for these updates? Okay. And these could be expansions to the app, changes to existing functionality, and so on. And, do they even offer revisions? This is something that you have to think about as well, because, just because an agency builds your minimum viable product doesn't mean that they're going to do every other little thing that your app involves throughout its lifetime. You might work with one agency in the beginning, and then you might need to switch later on because, because they don't offer the services you need anymore. This is very normal, but that's something that you have to understand. And you also have to understand that it doesn't matter who you work with, but whoever you work with, you're tied to them in terms of the speed at which you can progress. So what I'm going to put in here is speed, because, and this is important, if growing your revenue with your app is dependent on you moving forward in growing your user base, which also means it's likely dependent on you adding those updates that users are asking for and that users are needing. If building your revenue is dependent on that, but the speed at which you implement those updates and thus onboard additional users, if the speed at which you move is dependent on the agency being able to make those changes or fit you into their schedule, or the freelancer having availability in their schedule, well, then while those might not necessarily be expenses that you're incurring, they might be losses. So you may be losing the speed at which you can start building or generating that initial revenue, just because you are going to be dependent on the team that you're working with, and they're not always going to be available at the drop of a hat. Now, again, this is really going to vary. It's really going to depend on the type of relationship you're starting out with. But since we're talking about costs, understand that the more you pay, the more seamless this experience is going to be. So there are going to be less stopping and starting points. The less you pay, of course, the less seamless it's going to be. So these are variables that you just have to consider. And in this kind of post MVP stage where you're updating and iterating the app, depending on how much you're updating and iterating it, this could easily, 3x to 5x your costs plus. Again, this really depends. There is no, there's no hard answer for this, but that should at least give you an idea of what this can look like. So after that, you move into what's kind of the final phase of your development. This is really just the ongoing maintenance phase for your app. And this is where, you have that base app built, you have now made iterations, you've started bringing users on board, you've gotten that feedback, and you're expanding the app. So now what happens? Well, you can't just cut ties with your agency or your developers and call it a day. No, well, now you need them on a more ongoing basis because they have to maintain the app. That means making updates where necessary, fixing issues that come up where necessary. They have to continuously add new features to the app, for example, because you're never going to hit a quote unquote finish line with your app. It's never going to be finished. You're always going to be growing and expanding. That's the nature of app development. So you can never be finished with the agency or the freelancer. So, in this phase, you're really looking at maintenance and then those ongoing updates. And, usually in this case, once you reach this phase, you can start looking at some sort of a retainer, for example, because instead of just paying a lump sum for that initial app to be built, or paying a lump sum for a certain number of revisions to be made, for example, we're talking about ongoing for potentially years and years and years. So you're probably going to be shifting to more of a retainer type of situation. And again, this can vary drastically in terms of pricing. This really depends on quality. You can be looking at the thousands of dollars per month just for someone to maintain the app. If they're making significant updates, obviously that can go up. But you also have to think about whether or not the agency or the developers that you have been working with up to this point, again, whether they offer this type of thing or this type of relationship, because many don't. Many focus on that initial core development of the app, but they don't do the retainers so much. So in this situation, what often happens is you need to transition away from the agency you initially worked with or the developer you initially worked with. And even if you don't have to do it in, so soon as you move into this phase, it's not always, like a stick in the sand type of thing where this is the point in which you need to transition. But at some point, you'll likely need to transition anyways throughout the lifetime of your app. From one freelancer or agency to another, because maybe you outgrow the team or the person who you were working with previously, or maybe they outgrow you. That happens. Maybe you just need to part ways for whatever reason. And if that is the case, well, you have to look at those costs too, because the way that one person or team builds an app is not the way that another person or team is going to build the app. You know, app development isn't based on just this one set of, or this one definitive framework, for example. You can't just take one and pass it on and have it be the exact same. Every developer, every team is going to have their own tactics and strategies and methods and so on. And sometimes when you take an app that one person has built and you hand it to someone else, they need to rebuild a lot of it because it's just not how they would have built it. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just not easy for them to come in and take over something that wasn't built in a way that they themselves are used to apps being built, for example. So if you transition, what are the costs you're going to incur? Are you going to have to rebuild anything? Or are you going to have to train someone to come on? Or are you going to have to pay the agency or developer you were previously working with to train or to teach the new team how the app was built or how the app works, for example? These are costs that so many people, understandably so, just don't think about. And, you know, right now, if you're in that very initial stage with your app's development, it might not seem practical to think this far down the road. And in general, we don't advise it. But when it comes to the types of expenses you're going to incur when building your app, this is just something you have to understand because it's going to help you make the right decision with your app early on. We don't want you to get to a point where you didn't know what was coming, so you weren't able to plan ahead, and therefore you are stuck and you have wasted time and money. That is the last thing we would ever want for you. So even in looking at all these different costs and in looking at these different kind of phases that you're going to go through, the costs over the lifetime of your app can easily be in the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I'm talking about both with no-code apps and with traditional development agencies. You're looking at a good amount of money over the lifetime of your app. With that in mind, I said we were going to talk about an alternative approach to building your app as well, instead of outsourcing to a development agency or a team of freelancers. And that is building it yourself. Surprise, surprise. You know, the alternative is being able to build the app yourself. And with all the no-code tools out there today, this is something that is realistic for you. And this is something that we help entrepreneurs do every single day. So I can personally attest to the fact that it is a reality for you, no matter what your background is. So you don't have to be stuck and tied to this outsourcing path. You don't have to be stuck and tied to these expenses when building your app. Now, the thing is, if you're building your app yourself, what a lot of people think is, you know, they look at costs like this and they say, well, I don't want to spend that much. I'm going to build it myself. And then they expect it to be free. That's not going to be the case. You can't just decide to build the app yourself and expect the same outcome as if you were to outsource it. You can't expect the same outcome and then expect not to spend any money on it. It just doesn't work that way. So now I should say with a caveat, if you want to quit your job, spend, you know, years becoming a developer, that's one thing. I'm going to assume that you don't want to do that. So, you know, when building the app yourself, there are still going to be costs that you're going to incur, but it looks a little bit different than this path that you see on the screen right now. So if you're learning how to build a no-code app and how to build an MVP and learn how to move into all the next phases of development and so on, you can, number one, invest in courses, for example, and those could cost you in the hundreds of dollars potentially. Or you can invest in one of the programs like we run. We run a program called Built to Scale, where we take entrepreneurs through a 12-week process where they go from having their app idea to having their working minimum viable product. And of course, if you're investing in something that's immersive and all-encompassing and hands-on like this, that's going to cost you more so in the thousands if you decide to go that route. But it's important to understand that when you're building your app yourself and you're investing in things like that to help you, we're looking at this initial base cost, okay? Because you're investing in building that initial version of your app, but also building your skill set, right? And understanding the app development process, understanding how to think like a developer, for example. So we're talking about this initial phase, but it's important to remember that if you're building your app yourself, and in this initial phase, you have built the core of your app and you have built your skill set, that means that you get to decide exactly how much you spend in this post MVP stage, where you're starting to do your user testing and you're making these updates to your app. You're taking that feedback and adding on features, for example. You get to decide that, because if you've built the core product and you've built the skill set so you understand how that core product works, you can make the updates if you want. And so you decide the expenses there. And not only that, but when you move into that later maintenance stage, that ongoing stage where you're going to be maintaining the app, fixing any issues that come up, making updates just throughout the rest of your app's lifetime, you get to decide the types of investments you make at that stage too. Because again, you've built the core of the app, you've built your skill set, you have expanded the app beyond there, you know how it works, you know how to maintain it, you know how to update it. So it's up to you how much you want to spend there. You don't have to spend that 3 to 5x in that post MVP stage on top of that base cost you've incurred. And you don't have to spend money for all of this maintenance and these updates throughout the lifetime of your app, because you understand it. Now, that's not to say that you have to be the one doing it for the rest of your app's lifetime. At a certain point, you can decide to build your own team, but this is really key here. When you're building your app yourself, you understand how it's been built. And that means that you don't have to rely and depend on other agencies or other freelancers to tell you what needs to happen with the app in these later stages. You don't have to find someone who knows how to do this or who will do it how you want to, for example. You don't have to find someone in this stage who does the same. You can build a team around yourself. You can hire your own freelancer in-house, for example. You can train them on how you built the app and how you want it to be continued, or how you want to continue growing it down the road. That's up to you. The expenses are up to you. The team, if you have one, is totally up to you. The beauty in this is really that you're now self-reliant. And this is something that we talk about a lot with our own members and our own clients, because at the end of the day, that's really just what a lot of entrepreneurs in general want. They don't want to always depend on someone else. They want to be able to move however quickly they want. They want to be able to dictate their own budget, their own expenses. They want to be self-reliant. So this should give you a really good overview of not only those base costs that you're going to incur when you outsource your app, but the next step costs and next step costs and the ongoing costs throughout the entire lifetime of your app. And it should also give you an overview of an alternative path that you can take, one that you've likely potentially already considered, maybe not, but if you have, hopefully this sheds a little bit more light on what that looks like. And if you haven't thought about that yet, well, hopefully this opens up a new door for you. Now, if you are interested in taking that more self-reliant route, if that's one of your goals, to be able to have full control over not only your app, but your entire app's life cycle, we have a 12-week program called Built to Scale, where again, we take entrepreneurs from that idea stage to having their minimum viable product. And we give them the skills to build their app, and we're right there alongside them. But we create this self-reliance with them so that, number one, they don't have to depend on us long-term. But number two, they don't have to depend on anyone else long-term either. And that's really key for a lot of entrepreneurs. So if you feel the same, then you can head to coachingnocodeapps.com/apply. You can schedule a free strategy call to talk more about your app and whether this program would be the right fit for you as well. You'll send over some details and we'll take the next steps from there. So again, I hope this was helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll talk soon.